Hey guys, so today we're talking about the 1970s, and this is a decade wrought with hippies and counterculture, as well as issues with the Soviet Union. The Cold War is still going on. Vietnam ends during this time period. We will have a few presidents, including Nixon. We'll have Ford, and we'll have Jimmy Carter, peanut farmer, one of my favorites. Okay, so let's get going. Nixon, what we know about him thus far is that he expanded the war in Vietnam after he said he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam by bombing in Cambodia and Laos and sending more troops while in the midst of saying we're going to send more supplies and train the South Vietnamese. That was his policy of Vietnamization. Didn't really pan out that way. Let's see what Nixon is doing outside of Vietnam when it comes to foreign policy. So during this time period, we're going to have a shift of U.S. policy towards communism. Before it was the policy of containment, and containment meaning stopping the spread of communism. Détente is going to be a different type of policy, and it just means the easing of tensions. So Secretary of State Henry Kissinger at this time, he will really head this up, and the idea behind all of this easing of tensions is the idea of realpolitik, 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 and that's the idea that nations should pursue policies that are in their best interests and not worry about a worldview or what other nations should be doing. And so, in a sense, it's like if we have strong nations, they balance out each other. And that is essentially what Nixon says during this time period. Let me read you a quote. He calls it the balance of power. It will be a safer world and a better world if we have a strong, healthy United States, Europe, Soviet Union, China, and Japan, each balancing each other out. Nixon said that in 1971. And so Henry Kissinger will go to China and the Soviet Union and say, hey, we want to ease tensions with you. Would it be okay if we had met and had a peace meeting? You, me, and Richard Nixon. And of course, as we know from our reading, that Nixon will end up visiting China and the USSR. So let's learn about that. First place he visits in 1972, and this is very historic, that we have a president traveling to Asia, and especially China. If you remember, China turned to communism in the 1949 revolution, where Mao Zedong came to power. Mao Zedong, not a great leader, but pretty effective in keeping his rule over China, and there he is in the corner right there. So, in the Chinese Revolution of 1949, remember, a group of Chinese moved to Taiwan, and they themselves called Taiwan the People's Republic of China, while the communist China under Mao Zedong is saying, no, we are China, and the U.S. had recognized those fleeing communism under the policy of containment. Richard Nixon, under the policy of détente, will ease those tensions and will be the first president to recognize communist China as China. And now he kind of set it up in this weird situation where the United States to this day recognizes Taiwan as China and China as China. So kind of a sticky situation right there for the United States. During this time period, the Soviet Union will express desire to ease tensions with us as well, but one of the first things they do is not so great setup for that. In Czechoslovakia, and at this point it is Czechoslovakia, it is not Slovakia and the Czech Republic as it is today, as one nation, there's a protest against the Soviet sphere of influence, and it is a student-led protest that the Soviet Union comes in and steamrolls over them and squashes them, and the U.S. is so preoccupied with fighting in Vietnam that they don't even get involved in Czechoslovakia, as it is crying out, dying for help for us. So Nixon essentially kind of ignores that situation and still visits the capital of Russia. And when the new leader, Brezhnev, which I didn't include a picture, I'll have to show you guys in class, when the new leader comes to power after Khrushchev, he will say, Nixon, let's ease tensions, let's talk about reducing nuclear missiles. So Nixon goes to the USSR, meets with Brezhnev, and they come up with the SALT I treaty. And there will be a SALT II, we'll talk about that later. The SALT I is Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And essentially it is, we're going to stop making this type of missile, this nuclear missile. We're going to reduce our amount to just 200 per country, which is great. It's good that we have gotten to this point of easing tensions, that we're talking about getting rid of nuclear power, nuclear arms buildup. Here's the issue that then they didn't know, but now we know. Secretly, both nations were still continuing to build up nuclear power, but not missiles. So they got around the treaty. Instead, they'll start building up nuclear warheads. And I think I have a statistic here for you. So by the 1990s, 2 decades after this, each country, the US and the Soviet Union, will have over 20,000 nuclear warheads in their country. So yes, SALT 1 is great, but was it effective at nuclear arms reduction? No, just effective at nuclear missile reduction. One kind of weird foreign policy thing, we're going to see the rise of issues in the Middle East during this time period, especially because in 1949, or 1948, Israel was declared as a nation state for the Jewish people. And America backed that decision, and even into our current administration with President Trump, he has backed that decision to recognize Israel as its own country. Now, when Israel came in 1948-49, Arabs, Palestinian did not agree with that because their land was being taken, and those tensions are still around today as we see issues in the Middle East. During this time period, they will embargo oil to the United States, and here's why. There is a war called the Yom Kippur War, and it was waged by the Arabs and the Palestinians on one of the Jewish holy holidays, Yom Kippur. And essentially, it was just the rise of the tensions to the point that they couldn't take it anymore, and they attacked Israel, which was expanding during this time period. And so when the United States and other friendly nations that, like Great Britain and France that we're friends with, support Israel, then the Arab states will embargo oil to us, and that's an issue because we use that oil to power our factories, to power our cars, to essentially power our homes, our whole nation. The oil embargo will be eased and negotiated by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, but it's about to get worse. In 1972, I believe, I'm sorry, I lied, 1973, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, this is Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, and Venezuela, places where lots and lots and lots of oil is, they will form OPEC, the organization, I've already said that, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And this organization will come together because a lot of those are Arab states in that area with Israel, and raise the price of oil from $3 to $11.95 per barrel. So I just rounded up to 12 for your notes. And essentially the message they're sending is support the Arab nations and not Israel, or we won't sell you oil. And that's a very effective strategy for them to take because the United States is very dependent, even dependent to this day, on oil from the Middle East and Venezuela. So in the U.S., gas prices double, inflation goes up because the price of gas and oil and the things that we use to power affects absolutely everything. And there's an oil shortage. Now, Nixon won't ration oil, but later on we're going to see presidencies. While this is still happening, the oil shortage and the gas prices doubling happens for a very, very long time. It's going to get to a point where Americans have to ration their gas use. So if your license plate ends on an odd number, then you get gasoline on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. If your license plate ends on an even number, then you get it Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. It's closed on Sunday, can't buy gas. That sort of situation is going to be reality for Americans living in the 70s and 80s. All right, next picture. Love this. This is Nixon's signature pose, and he is harking back to Winston Churchill's 1945 campaign, V for Victory. But what is most famous about this picture is not him saying victory in Vietnam. It's actually, this is the exact pose he takes as he's leaving the White House, and they take a picture of him after Watergate when he resigns. He's like, yeah, like great remorse there, Richard. So let's talk about what he does at home. This is leading up to Watergate stuff. I know that's what you all really want to know. During this time period, Richard Nixon is going to pass a few things that have to do with the environment, a few things that have to do with government regulation of businesses, and with welfare, helping poor families. One of the first is revenue sharing, and this is, I believe, $10 billion. Let me find it in my notes really quick. Oh, I lied. $30 billion over 5 years in 1972 to share with the states. And along with this bill, it wasn't passed in the bill, but it was insinuated that the states would use that to help low-income families and establish a minimum wage for those considered low income. But that wasn't put in the bill, just kind of like Nixon nudging them saying, hey, you should do it this way. One organization put up during this time period is OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And OSHA, as we know it today, is a government organization that regulates businesses and makes sure that it's safe where you work. Now, I know you're thinking like factories and people's hands getting cut off and stuff, but let me give you a modern day example of OSHA. My dad works for Louisville Metro Police Department. And on his floor, the floor above was where overflow prisoners were held. Well, the prisoners in protest backed up the toilets, and like poop and sewage was coming down through the ceilings of where my father worked. And even though they cleaned it all up, OSHA said, nope, that's very, very dangerous. You can't be around other people's bodily fluids and sewage. And so that floor is condemned, and no one can work on that floor or be on that floor. That's just an example of something that OSHA does in modern times. Also during this time period, we're going to have the enactment of environmental legislation. In 1970 will be the first Earth Day, April 22nd, and that just kind of kicks off what's kind of been coming up, people caring a lot about the environment. Also a book called Silent Spring that exposed the poisonous effects of pesticides. Yeah, you think you're eating healthy, but look at the stuff that we use to treat our food. Nixon, not a fan of all this environment stuff, but he goes along with it. He will actually sign into law the Environmental Protection Agency, and if you've ever seen the Simpsons movie, this is what the grandpa has a premonition about in church. And he's like, Eepa, Eepa, and he has a seizure and falls down, and they roll him up in the carpet. And it's all about Homer Simpson dumping pig poop into a lake. Anyway, go watch the Simpsons movie. It's great. It has nothing to do with U.S. history. But EPA at the time is made to reduce automobile and factory emissions, clean up pollution, and it's not to stop the issues of environment legislation. It's just to kind of like put a Band-Aid on it. Also passed during this time, Endangered Species Act makes the bald eagle an endangered species, so yay. One thing I want to talk about that is not really, really quickly because I'm running out of time, but is not actually on your notes, just want you to know about it. In 1979, there was something called a 3 Mile incident, and this has to do with the environment as well. It was a nuclear power plant in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and at this plant, a nuclear reactor overreacted, I guess, got a little bit angry, and the core that's producing the energy in the nuclear reactor started leaking, and just not a visible leak, and so it got into the steam, which then turned into condensation when it gets cold. That gets into the water, groundwater, so people are afraid during this time period, if they live in this area, that their water that could possibly be infected by 3 Mile Island had radioactivity in it. So 100,000 citizens of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania are evacuated. The reactor is shut down for 6 years. A lot of the power in the area doesn't work because it was fueled by the nuclear reactor. And this isn't an issue, like it's not going to be on your AP test, but it just shows you the issue of environmentalism during the 1970s. It's a huge deal. A bunch of people protest against nuclear weapons as well as nuclear reactors as a way to power our country, as that it's not clean energy. And clean energy is still a fight that we fight today, whether or not to use coal. For example, in Eastern Kentucky, that's a huge, huge issue because coal fuels their economy, but it's also very bad for the environment. And instead moving to things like wind power. If you've ever driven to Chicago up through Indiana, you see miles and miles and miles of windmills. So environmentalism is an issue that really comes to a head in the 70s and is still an issue today.